Everything you think you know about the Vikings is wrong. Okay, not everything. But I do want to talk about a handful of common misconceptions, some cool facts, and some of those moments where people go, gotcha. All of that is going to make you sound way more intelligent when talking to your friends about the Viking Age. The last one that I'm going to share is the most controversial, and I've had a hard time resisting jumping in when somebody makes a post about the word Viking on social media. P.S. Here's my advice. Don't do that. Don't do what I do. If you've noticed, there's this weird fixation on a handful of things that revolve around the Viking Age. One is horned helmets. The other is the idea that Vikings raided nonstop, and that somehow they were only barbaric, uncouth, dirty, tangled hair, rotten teeth, and stinky. And that's just because somewhere along the way, myth became rumor, and rumor became perceived reality. That and a whole bunch of other interesting facts were just lost over time. Some of that is also due to history teachers that taught us that history is boring, instead of helping students engage with history using their imagination, which is exactly what we try to do with each and every episode. So if you're new to the show, this is a little bit of a departure. We do try to tell the history and the stories, and we try to make it feel immersive, that you feel like you've traveled to Greenland with Eric the Red. And so we want to take history, we want to learn history, but we want to do it in a way that is engaging, that engages our minds, not just this is useless information, or what am I going to do with this? Where do I put this? Where do I store it? I got Google, I can just look things up. But today we're going to have to buckle up because we're going to zoom through 20 different facts of the Viking Age that will definitely make you sound smarter than your friends. So what we're talking about here is the truth about their weapons, hygiene, their legal system, currency, why the Viking Age still inspires us today. You may have to listen more than once, but I'm telling you, after this, you'll be right up there with the top 1% of people who know something about the Viking Age. All right, before we jump in, I don't normally do this, but if you like history, you like the Viking Age, and you're into the stories that they produced and learning in a creative storytelling fashion, then go ahead, hit the follow and subscribe button right now. Because this show isn't just about what happened 1,000 years ago. It's about seeing their world differently, accurately, and how it inspires us to move forward, to be better, to reach our full potential. So here we go. If in the next few minutes you catch yourself thinking, wait a second, I didn't know that. That is your cue to subscribe. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start by ruining a few childhood assumptions and comic book misnomers. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets. I'm sure you already know that, but if you didn't, here you go. That whole look, which we see everywhere, is just a false stereotype. But it is recognizable, it is iconic, and now it is synonymous with Vikings. But it is completely made up. Someone in the 19th century looked at the Vikings wearing their very practical, functional helmets and said, you know what this needs? Horns. And now Viking mascots have horned helmets. Even our podcast logo has a silly horned helmet. Not because it's historically accurate, but because it's universally recognizable. That leads us to the next misnomer. Vikings weren't just warriors, they were farmers. They weren't out raiding 24/7. Raiding was actually seasonal. Farming, however, it was survival, and everyone partook. It was more like spring you plant barley, and instead of watching it grow, you headed across the sea towards England to see what they were up to. And then you returned in time to harvest the barley, survive the winter, and do it all again next year. The Viking Age was mainly agriculture, but it did have its occasional international pillaging. Now swords we often see in battle scenes and fight scenes, and we think, oh yeah, that's the weapon of choice during the Middle Ages. Well, swords were very expensive and they were very rare. If you had a sword, you were somebody. It was a status symbol. So most Vikings, they fought with spears and axes, not necessarily because they were more functional, but because they were more accessible, cheaper to make, easier to build, already on hand in many cases. And they were also brutally effective. During the Viking Age, a sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a status symbol, a flex. So Vikings took sword ownership to the next level, which we're going to hear about in just a moment. Vikings didn't have minted coins. They paid in hacksilver. There was no common currency that day in Scandinavia, but they did have silver. which they would cut into pieces or cut from rings, jewelry, anything that was of silver. So they had coins, obviously, from various parts of the world, places that had tried to mint coins and produce a currency. But what they did is they waited out for payment. So when you'd buy something, you would break off a piece of silver, you'd weigh it, and then the deal was done. It could be an arm ring, it could be half a coin. It wouldn't matter as long as it weighed true. And so it was a currency with scales. It was an economy based on the weight of silver, and they used scales to determine the value. And then there's 1942. We all know the rhyme. Columbus, he sailed the ocean blue, except he came in second place by about 500 years because Leif Erikson was the first European to set foot in North America. It wasn't Columbus. Leif Erikson and the settlers of Greenland, they sailed across the Atlantic to Vinland. And they built settlements. They didn't stay long. You can listen to the episode on Vinland to find out why. And they did it 500 years before Columbus was even born. So the next time you celebrate Columbus Day, just tell everybody Happy Leif Erikson Day instead. So we just moved through 5 facts. No horned helmets. They were mainly farmers. They had swords. Swords were luxury items. Their currency was hacksilver. And Leif Erikson is the greatest European adventurer of all time. So we know 5 facts that most people have no idea about. And maybe some of those are not new to you. But let's continue. See if we can get one that stands out. Viking ships could sail in shallow water. These ships, they weren't just built for oceans. They could glide through rivers quickly and quietly, and they could go further inland than anyone expected, which means if you thought you were safe because you lived inland from the coast, well, surprise, you're not. The Vikings very well could be at your doorstep right now. Once you see the value of sailing up rivers with armies, you begin to see why the Vikings were so successful and why Scandinavian expansion exploded as quickly as it did. While the rest of Europe was focused on sailing across the ocean in big, heavy vessels, while most of Europe saw rivers as an obstacle, the Vikings saw them as a path to their destiny. And no, Vikings didn't stink. Actually, they were very clean. They bathed. They had a regular bath day, the washing day of the week. Literally, that was the day of the week. It said the washing day. They had combs, they had tweezers, they had other grooming tools. The rest of medieval Europe was inventing perfume at the time, trying to stay one step ahead of their poor body odor. Women during the Viking Age had rights. They could own property. They could even file for divorce. The women had just as much legal right in many ways as the men did. Let's just say they were one step ahead, maybe a handful of steps ahead of the rest of the world. There were many circumstances that allowed for women to initiate divorce, and you can look them up. I won't bore you with all the details, but there were many circumstances that allowed for a woman to initiate divorce. She could also own property. She could run a family business, hold a position of authority. Compared to the rest of Europe, this was a very different system. And when things got legal, they had a legal assembly. They called it the thing. It was not a random object, not a thing. It was the thing. It was a legal gathering where disputes were settled, laws were made, and decisions were argued out in the public. So you think of a courtroom, but outside, and probably with a lot more tension, yelling, and, axes on hand. The word thing is still used throughout Scandinavia and Iceland. And so they had an effective legal system for that time. Speaking of which, there were no prisons during the Viking Age, no long-term sentences, no holding cells. If you were found guilty, you paid a fine, or you were exiled, or things escalated quickly, and, you know how that ends. Justice wasn't about containment, it was about quick and effective resolution. Right, so we've moved through 5 more. Let's recap. Vikings were great at sneak attacks, not just coastlines, but riverbanks as well. You couldn't smell them coming because they didn't smell. They were very clean. The legal system allowed women to own property, divorce their husbands if the circumstances were right. Crimes that were committed were dealt with swiftly. Now, what about berserkers? What about their belief in fate? Well, that's what's coming next. But real quick, as we continue this thread of the law, outlawry was a very common form of punishment where you would be ostracized from your society. And if you were declared an outlaw, you lost all protection under the law. You were legally killable. When the sentence came down, it essentially said, good luck, because now anybody could kill you for revenge and it would not be considered murder. So you better hightail it out of there. And if you're on your own and you have nothing in the Scandinavian wilderness, well, good luck. Vikings, They traveled far and wide. They traveled as far as the Middle East, and we're talking thousands of miles. But again, go back to the river system that allowed them to reach those places. Silver coins from the Islamic world are found throughout Scandinavia. They are still being discovered throughout Scandinavia. The Vikings, in my opinion, traveled further than any European at that time. Part of the reason is because they connected themselves to strategic trade routes. And that economic move, it was a move of brilliance. They were connected to roads like the Silk Road, trade routes that went to Byzantium, trade routes that went into the Middle East. And so they were tied to it all, and they used those roads to travel. And that's where you begin to see that trade alone should help us get the picture that Vikings weren't just about raiding. They were surviving, and they were trying to build a future for themselves and for their families. And so how they got there, again, through the water, through the design of their boats. They were masters of water. They navigated places without compasses, no GPS, just the sun, the stars, memory, a sensitivity to the wind and waves, and maybe a little Icelandic spar, that crystal that allows you to locate the sun when the clouds are in the way. They navigated some of the most difficult open oceans known to man, even to this day considered very treacherous waters to sail. They were constantly pushing the limits, and that is why they left their mark on history. Now, berserkers were tough. They were strong, muscular. They were everything that you imagine that they would be. They were not invincible, but they used something that was one step ahead of their time: psychological warfare. These were the warriors that fought in this rage state. And some people think that they took wild mushrooms to get into that mood and that frenzy. Most scholars debate whether or not that's true, but they don't debate that they were fighting in some sort of enhanced rage state, but that's possibly because they had a ritual to enhance their performance, almost to get psyched up and to get their mind in the right place. Whether this was to create boldness before they would go into battle, it had an unintended consequence, because what it did is it created intimidation. Because imagine facing someone who looks completely unafraid of death. Even if you managed to kill the beast of a man, he was going to take you out with him. And in some ways, having a berserker on your side helped decide the battle before it even started, and gave the Vikings a reputation for strength and brutality, and a mindset that couldn't be rivaled going into battle. So the advantage always went to the berserker. And if you mix in the Vikings' belief in fate, then things begin to make even more sense. Because fate says that the outcome is unavoidable. That's right. It's all predetermined. You can't escape your destiny. Your life, your death, your place in this world, it's already written. The only question is, how are you going to meet it? Are you going to meet it with courage or without? And that mindset creates a very specific kind of person. Someone who isn't trying to avoid death, but rather trying to face it honorably. So the Vikings believed in predetermined fate. And right there, you can see how much depth there is to the Viking world. They could erase people legally. They traded across continents. They navigated oceans without instruments. They didn't just fight with weapons. They were the weapon. See, most people think of the Vikings as simple barbarians, a whole bunch of chaos and cool boats. But this is the part where all of that falls short. It falls apart. Because they were a civilization, a society, just like anyone else. And they had important things that they invented as a civilization that still echo across centuries. Now back to swords, the status symbol. What they did with them is they named them. They gave them names. Swords were extremely expensive, so they didn't treat them like any other tool. Axes and spears didn't have names, but a sword did. And that's partially because they knew that a sword could actually outlive them. And so they would be passed down as heirlooms, and they would be remembered, they'd be talked about. They would even have a reputation, and there are sagas dedicated to swords. Some of them are cursed, but still dedicated to swords, and the swords have names. Now here's one twist. Not all Vikings were Scandinavian at the time. Viking wasn't a nationality back then. It was something that you did. If you weren't trading and exploring, but instead you went raiding, then you were going Viking. You were doing something. So technically, Viking was more of a job description than a birthright. And that's the point I'll come back to in just a moment. And that's the one that I'll circle back to here in just a moment. We're almost done. then there's this debate, and not everybody likes talking about this subject, but that Christianity reshaped the Viking world. By the end of the Viking Age, the old gods, they faded. Not gone completely. I'm not trying to say that they disappeared altogether, but there was definitely a new belief system, a new structure, and slowly the culture began to shift. It was the same people, but just a different world now. That in of itself isn't that controversial or debated, but what is, was the conversion genuine, or was it forced? Was there political pressure, or were there advantages to be gained by becoming Christian? And did it really take over Scandinavia, or was that just the narrative recorded by Christian authors? But then you have to ask yourself the question is, was Christianity the reason that the killing and the raiding and the slave trading all ended? Or would that have happened naturally at some point on its own? This is where debate takes place, and this is where people can continue the conversation in the comment sections of this episode or over on Discord. Greenland became part of the Viking world towards the end of the Viking Age. Eric the Red, he sailed from Iceland to Greenland. He settled there in that ice-covered land. And he named it Greenland because he wanted to attract fellow settlers. He needed to position this big parcel of land as something desirable. So when he went back to Iceland to recruit people, he said, why don't you come live with me in this new land, this new frontier? It's called Greenland. And so people's imaginations got the better of themselves. They thought of green hills and a Viking paradise. And so people came, and, well, since it wasn't an easy journey, many of them stayed. The really fascinating part is that the settlement in Greenland lasted over 500 years. So they did succeed in building a community in a very harsh land. So here we are at number 20. Some Vikings, or at least those rooted in the Viking world, became kings in foreign lands. They didn't just raid kingdoms, they helped build them into what they are today. England, France, parts of Eastern Europe, they didn't just show up and take things then leave. Sometimes they stayed and they took over. And so there's a lot of Viking influence in medieval European history. Well, let's consider what we've talked about today. Before we wrap this up and review what we've learned today, I want to circle back to the word Viking, because this is one that you'll see on social media time and time again. Somebody will post something about Vikings, and then somebody will chime in the comment section, and they will say, Viking is not a people group, it's a verb, it's an action, it's something that they did, or it's a job title. And that all is fine, and that's true. However, don't try to sound so smart that you miss the fact that words, so we're talking about etymology and the study of words. You see, words change over time. Definitions, meanings, acceptance within new cultures change over time. And so the word Viking today can be used as a reference to a people group from Scandinavia to Greenland and Iceland included, to those who lived in England. I mean, Canute became king of England at some point. He was still a Viking. And so we look back and we say, you know what, we need a word that describes this people, all of them. Because, you know, if we say Scandinavian, then we're leaving out Iceland and Greenland. And so why not just say, hey, this word represents all of these people and this entire age that affected major parts of European history. There are lots of words, if you can look them up. But for example, the word knight, the knight in shining armor, that word originally meant servant or slave. And now, guess what? It doesn't mean that to us anymore. It means somebody in armor, somebody who's noble, somebody who's a warrior, who carries a sword. And so words change. The word awful back in the Middle Ages wasn't something bad. It was awful, full of awe. The word villain, it didn't mean the bad guy. It meant a peasant. And so you can see that words and meanings change, and definitions and how we use a word changes. So it's okay to understand the root of the Viking word, and it's great to know how they used it. They did not refer to themselves as Vikings, and the English didn't refer to them as Vikings. They were just heathens or the Danes. But just know, words change, and we can use it however we want, because at some point, it's the society, it's the culture that we live in that defines words, and words will continue to change. And you can probably think of others besides the ones that I listed. So you can sound smart, say, hey, originally this word was used this way, but don't harp on people that use the word Viking to refer to Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, who lived in Greenland. They were Vikings. And so why does all this matter? Why go through these 20 facts? Because somehow the people of the Viking Age have been reduced to muscular men with long beards beating their chest and yelling, fearless, running into battle. That's why it matters, because their history is deeper than what most people think. And history doesn't just tell us what people did, it tells us what people believed and what they thought was worth doing and what they cared about. The Vikings lived in a world where comfort wasn't guaranteed, safety wasn't assumed, and reputation mattered more than anything. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They moved, they explored, they built lives in places that didn't want them there. And here's the uncomfortable part. They didn't see risk as something to avoid. They saw it more as something to be managed or sometimes even chased. And so whether you admire that or not, it forces the question, what are you doing? One of my favorite quotes in history is, those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it, which is why history is important. Got to learn history so that we don't make the same mistakes that other people made. But I have a version that sounds like this. Those who remember the past are blessed to be inspired by it. And so when we look at the past, we look at the Viking Age, we look at all that they did, all that they were, we can be inspired by their bravery, by how they embraced the challenge, how they adventured further than anyone. So now that you've heard these 20 facts about the Viking Age, you are ready to engage the next time you have a conversation with someone about the Viking Age. And the next time you watch a show or a movie, you're going to pick up on more details, subtle details. You say, ooh, I know that. I see that. That is accurate. That's exactly what they did. And it's really fun. It's really cool to be able to watch Viking shows, things that people make, and see the attention to detail that people put into it. And if you've made it this far in the episode, you have definitely expanded your Viking Age horizon. You know more than most people do. They weren't just raiders and all about chaos with dragon-headed boats. They were farmers, traders, explorers who pushed past the edge of the known world. And they didn't ask permission to do it. They went for it. They were bold. They were strong. They built. They adapted. They endured. And maybe that is why they still grip our imagination today, because somewhere deep down we recognize it. We recognize what we need. We recognize the pull to go forward. And what they had, what they possessed, whether you realize it or not, it's in you too. That desire to test the edge, to face the challenges that are in front of you, to meet them well. And if you learned something new today, I'm going to ask you, share this with someone who still thinks the Vikings wore horned helmets. Or don't. That way you can keep your advantage and the knowledge all to yourself, so you'll sound super smart next time someone brings up the Viking Age. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, please do that. Now, the algorithm loves when podcasts gain subscribers on a regular basis. So subscribing helps the show more than you know. The next story, hey, it's already in the queue, and it's going to be even better. So don't miss it. Until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.